70%. That is how much of Canadian exports still flow to the United States, despite 18 months of escalating tariffs. But here is what the numbers actually reveal. Canada has built an entirely new economic architecture, while American consumers absorbed $1,300 in additional costs per household. The conventional wisdom said tariffs would force Canada into submission. Instead, Mark Carney signed 12 trade agreements on 4 continents, secured billions in Gulf investment, and positioned Canada as the leader of what he calls a middle powers movement. The policy designed to break Canadian dependence created something far more dangerous for American leverage. It created alternatives. The economic relationship between the United States and Canada has been described as the most integrated bilateral trade partnership in the world. $2.5 billion in goods and services cross the border every single day. Annual bilateral trade exceeds $1.3 trillion. The two economies share supply chains so interconnected that a single automobile crosses the border up to 8 times during production. Energy pipelines, electrical grids, and telecommunications networks operate as unified continental systems rather than national ones. This integration was supposed to be American leverage. It was supposed to make Canada dependent, but dependency works both ways. And when the second Trump administration implemented sweeping tariffs beginning in early 2025, the strategic calculation seemed straightforward. A 25% levy on most Canadian imports and 10% on energy products would force concessions. The administration invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, claiming Canadian trade practices constituted a national emergency. This legal mechanism, typically reserved for genuine security concerns, became the foundation for the largest restructuring of North American trade since 1989. The initial results appeared to confirm the strategy. Canadian exports to the United States dropped 15.7% following tariff announcements. Imports from the United States fell 10.8%. Canada's merchandise trade surplus with the United States narrowed to $3.6 billion in April 2025, the smallest surplus since December 2020. The integrated supply chains that once represented economic efficiency began functioning as transmission mechanisms for policy disruption. And this is where the assumptions collapsed. The fundamental premise of tariff strategy assumes that import-dependent trading partners have no viable alternatives. This assumption has proven catastrophically wrong in the Canadian context. Rather than capitulating to American demands, Prime Minister Mark Carney launched what he called a strategic transformation. The former governor of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England brought decades of experience navigating financial crises. His approach combined immediate relief measures with structural changes designed to reduce Canadian vulnerability to American economic pressure permanently. Canada allocated $5 billion through a strategic response fund to help companies adapt. The Business Development Bank of Canada received $500 million specifically for small and medium enterprises facing trade disruption. Farm Credit Canada deployed $1 billion for the agricultural sector. Export Development Canada committed $5 billion over 2 years through its Trade Impact Program. The total government commitment to tariff response measures now exceeds $20 billion. This represents one of the largest peacetime economic interventions in Canadian history. But relief programs only address symptoms. The real strategy targeted the underlying vulnerability. In October 2025, Carney announced an audacious goal: double non-American exports over the next decade, from approximately $300 billion to $600 billion. Skeptics dismiss this as political theater. The data suggests otherwise. Export growth to non-American markets increased by 8.3% year to date. Merchandise exports to the United Kingdom grew by about $9.7 billion in the first 9 months compared to the prior year. Exports to the European Union increased by just over $5 billion. Petroleum exports to China grew by more than 240% following the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. The government committed $6 billion over 7 years to build trade infrastructure connecting Canadian businesses to global markets. The Trade Diversification Corridor Fund and Arctic Infrastructure Fund aim to create shipping routes and logistics networks that bypass American ports entirely. Port expansions on both coasts, railway upgrades to move goods east and west rather than south, digital custom systems to facilitate faster processing with non-American partners. Canada reached its previous diversification target of increasing overseas exports by 50% ahead of schedule. The numbers reveal an uncomfortable truth. On January 16, 2026, Carney flew to Beijing for the first visit by a Canadian prime minister to China in 8 years. The relationship had been frozen since the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in 2018 at American request. China retaliated by detaining 2 Canadian citizens and imposing punishing tariffs on Canadian agricultural exports. The diplomatic thaw required careful navigation of American concerns while pursuing Canadian economic interests. The outcome represented a calculated gamble. Canada agreed to reduce tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to 6.1%. In exchange, China would lower tariffs on Canadian canola from 85% to 15% and eliminate duties on canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas. The deal allows 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into Canada annually, growing to 70,000 within 5 years. This provision ensures affordable vehicles reach Canadian consumers while opening Chinese investment opportunities. President Trump himself initially called the deal a good thing and said Carney should be making such agreements. Then he changed his mind. The contradictory response from Washington highlighted something analysts had noted for months. The incoherence in American trade policy messaging was creating opportunities for nimble partners to exploit. This reveals a strategic miscalculation few anticipated. 2 days before Davos, Carney made history with the first ever visit by a sitting Canadian prime minister to Qatar. The Gulf state committed to significant strategic investments in Canadian nation-building projects. After years of stalled negotiations, the leaders agreed to finalize an investment promotion and protection agreement by summer 2026. This will enable Canadian businesses to more easily expand operations in Qatar, a country with an economy worth nearly $290 billion. The agreement covers AI, quantum computing, aerospace, defense technologies, advanced manufacturing, agriculture, and agri-food. Qatar is the third largest economy in the Gulf region. Its investment in Canada grows by nearly 20% annually. A new double taxation agreement will make it easier for Canadians to work and invest in Qatar and vice versa. Canada will establish a defense attaché office in Doha to increase bilateral engagement and defense sector exports. 4 days after Beijing, Carney delivered a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos that received a standing ovation. This is unusual for such gatherings where polite applause is the norm. Without naming the United States directly, Carney declared that the rules-based international order had experienced a rupture, not a transition. Great powers have begun using economic integration as tools of coercion, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as pressure, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. The phrase that captured global attention was this: middle powers must act together because if we are not at the table, we are on the menu. Finland's President Alexander Stubb called it one of the best speeches delivered at Davos that week. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said the speech is evidence that Canada is back as a pivotal NATO participant and global leader. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace observed that Carney's address was the first time a leader of a close American ally had the courage to stand up to President Trump and say, "Enough is enough." The international response revealed something Washington may have underestimated. Allied frustration with American policy had reached a breaking point. The real-world consequences continue accelerating. In January 2026, Canada signed a memorandum of understanding with South Korea to bring Korean automotive manufacturing to Canadian soil. The agreement establishes a Canada-Korea Industrial Cooperation Committee focused on future mobility. It includes intentions to advance a Korean automotive footprint in Canada and domestic electric vehicle manufacturing opportunities. The two countries will cooperate on growing Korea's battery manufacturing presence and the battery supply chain, including critical mineral extraction and refinement. Canada's automotive industry contributes $16.8 billion to gross domestic product and supports more than 550,000 jobs. South Korea produced over 4 million vehicles in 2024, more than double the number produced in Canada. Hyundai Motor Group, which includes Hyundai, Kia, and Genesis brands, sold over 154,000 vehicles in Canada last year. The memorandum signals potential for Korean automakers to establish production facilities where none currently exist. This directly counters the American strategy of using tariffs to attract manufacturing. On February 5th, 2026, Carney launched a comprehensive automotive strategy. Canada maintains counter tariffs on auto imports from the United States to ensure a level playing field for Canadian automotive manufacturers. A new $2.3 billion program offers individuals and businesses purchase or lease incentives of up to $5,000 for battery, electric, and fuel cell vehicles. $1.5 billion flows through the Canada Infrastructure Bank for charging and hydrogen refueling infrastructure across the country. The government strengthens Canada's automotive remission framework to reward companies that produce and invest in Canada. Officials create a new import credit scheme that helps auto companies lower their tariff bill based on Canadian investment. The strategy combines immediate worker support through the laid-off worker support program with long-term industrial transformation. The goal is clear. Make Canada a destination for automotive investment regardless of American policy. Meanwhile, American consumers continue paying the bill. The Tax Foundation calculates that current tariffs constitute the largest American tax increase as a percentage of gross domestic product since 1993. By January 2026, the weighted average tariff rate on all American imports reached 16.8%, according to CNN. The effective rate represents the highest average since 1946. Per household, this translates to an average burden of $1,000 in 2025 and $1,300 in 2026. Goldman Sachs economists estimate that businesses absorbed roughly 80% of tariff costs in 2025. Companies drew down inventory stockpiles accumulated before tariffs took effect and accepted reduced profit margins. However, their projections indicate this proportion could shrink to just 20% by late 2026 as stockpiles deplete. JP Morgan projects tariffs will raise inflation by 1% between the second half of 2025 and the first half of 2026. The Federal Reserve confirms tariffs explain roughly 0.5 percentage points of headline inflation and around 0.4 percentage points of core inflation. The Peterson Institute warns inflation could exceed 4% by the end of 2026 when combined with fiscal expansion, tightening labor supply from immigration changes, and accommodative financial conditions. Consumer goods with the steepest price increases tend to be those with lower profit margins where absorbing tariffs proves difficult. But here is what the administration did not anticipate. The Supreme Court is evaluating whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act includes authority to impose tariffs. A ruling is expected in early 2026. If the court declares these tariffs unlawful, the administration could lose the ability to collect duties and might need to return revenues already received. JP Morgan estimates IEEPA measures account for roughly 61% of the year-to-date increase in American tariffs, approximately $180 billion on an annualized basis. A court ruling against the administration could invalidate more than half of the current tariff structure. Political strategists see a 70% chance the tariffs get struck down. If IEEPA tariffs are ruled illegal, the average statutory rate would drop to 10.4% from 16.1%. The Tax Policy Center estimates households would save an average of $1,200 in 2026 if tariffs are overturned and not replaced. The administration says it has backup options under Sections 232, 301, and 338 of various trade acts. But each carries limitations. Section 122 allows tariffs of only 15% and requires congressional approval for extensions beyond 150 days. This legal uncertainty compounds the strategic exposure. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement faces a joint review in 2026. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told Congress that changes are required before the administration agrees to extend the pact beyond its 2036 expiration. He listed conditions including stricter rules of origin for automobiles, changes to agricultural market access, and modifications to digital services provisions. Canada has signaled it will not accept terms that compromise sovereignty. The Bank of Canada projects that tariffs have placed economic activity on a persistently lower growth path. GDP growth is expected to slow to 1.1% in 2026 from 1.3% in 2025. However, RBC economists note per capita GDP is on track to increase in 2025 for the first time in 3 years. Export diversification has provided some relief with export value to non-American and non-Chinese markets rising 23% year to date. The fiscal boost in Canada for 2026 is estimated at more than 2%, the largest since 1980. Oxford Economics notes that if trade risks ease through USMCA renegotiation, 2026 could mark an inflection point for business investment and productivity growth. Healthy corporate balance sheets and favorable borrowing conditions mean Canadian firms should have ready access to capital needed for an investment renaissance. Consider what this pattern reveals. Canada is pursuing free trade pacts with India, Thailand, the Philippines, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and Mercosur, the South American bloc including Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The European Union and India announced a landmark free trade deal in the same week as Carney's Davos speech. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen declared that nostalgia will not bring back the old order and called for Europe to build a new, independent future. Canadian travel to the United States dropped 40% in February 2025 compared to February 2024. Provincial governments implemented countermeasures ranging from removing American products from store shelves to canceling contracts with American companies, including Ontario's $100 million Starlink agreement. The Buy Canadian movement became a cultural phenomenon, with retailers prominently displaying Canadian-made products and consumers actively seeking domestic alternatives. The Canadian agri-food sector adopted a $12 billion plan to halve dependence on the American market within years. Energy exports diversify rapidly. In Newfoundland and Labrador, more than half of oil exports now go to Europe or Asia, compared to less than 10% 2 decades ago. The Trans Mountain pipeline expansion enables Canadian crude to reach Asian markets at scale for the first time, breaking the historical pattern of selling discounted oil exclusively to American refineries. This brings us to the central question. The policy designed to force Canada into submission has instead accelerated Canadian independence. The tariffs meant to protect American jobs cost American households $1,300 annually, while Canadian workers bear the brunt of actual job losses in the short term. The pressure intended to prevent Canadian diversification pushed Canada into partnerships with China, Europe, South Korea, Qatar, and emerging Asian markets. The negotiating leverage expected from economic dominance has eroded as Canada demonstrates alternatives exist. Manufacturing jobs as a share of Ontario's total employment recently fell below 10% for the first time since record-keeping began in 1976. The General Motors layoffs at Oshawa affected up to 1,200 workers across the supply chain. Windsor hit 11.1% unemployment, the highest of any major Canadian city. The Ontario Financial Accountability Office projected tariffs would result in 68,100 fewer jobs in Ontario in 2025 alone. These are real costs, real families affected, real communities disrupted, but they are also creating political will for permanent structural change. Canadians across the political spectrum now support reducing dependence on American markets. The question is no longer whether to diversify, but how quickly it can be accomplished. The data points to a fundamental miscalculation. Tariffs work when the target has no alternatives. They work when pain can be concentrated while benefits diffuse across a larger economy. They work when the target lacks resources to sustain resistance or build new relationships. They work when the target's political system cannot withstand short-term costs for long-term transformation. None of these conditions apply to Canada. The country has substantial financial resources. It has existing trade agreements with Europe, Asia, and South America that can be leveraged. It has natural resources the world wants. It has a political system where both major parties now support diversification. And it has a prime minister who spent his career as a central banker understanding exactly how economic leverage works and how to counter it. The cost of this policy is now measurable. $500 million deployed through the Business Development Bank, $5 billion through the Strategic Response Fund, $6 billion for trade infrastructure, 12 deals on 4 continents, $16.8 billion contributed by the auto sector to Canadian gross domestic product, 550,000 automotive jobs supported, $1,300 per American household, 68,000 jobs projected to disappear in Ontario. These are not talking points. These are the measurable consequences of a strategy that assumed Canada had no options. The numbers expose the limits of American economic leverage when applied to a sophisticated trading partner with global connections, substantial resources, and the political will to transform its economy rather than submit. The question is no longer whether Canada can survive without preferential American market access. The question is whether the costs imposed on American consumers and workers are worth the diminishing leverage gained over a neighbor that has demonstrated willingness to build an economic future less dependent on its southern partner. The World Trade Organization revised its forecast for global trade growth in 2026 to just 0.5%, down from 1.8% previously. Rising protectionist measures worldwide have created a negative feedback loop that suppresses economic activity everywhere. The International Monetary Fund projects global GDP growth will reach only 3% in 2025, down from 3.3% in 2024. American manufacturing has not expanded sufficiently to replace imported goods. Consumers face higher prices and fewer choices. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that tariff policies will increase the average annual rate of inflation by roughly 0.4 percentage points over 2025 and 2026. By 2026, the price index for personal consumption expenditures will be 0.9% higher than it otherwise would have been. Real American GDP growth over 2025 and 2026 is approximately 0.5 percentage points lower each year due to new tariffs. Payroll employment is estimated to be 490,000 lower by the end of 2025 than it otherwise would have been. The Yale Budget Lab estimates a pre-substitution income loss of approximately $1,800 per household on average. Apparel prices rise 17% from all 2025 tariff actions. Food prices increased 2.8%. Metals, leather, and apparel products face consumer price increases between 28 and 40% in the short run. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence is what economists call preference formation. Canadians who spent 2025 building relationships with European, Asian, and Middle Eastern partners will not simply abandon those connections when American policy eventually shifts. Businesses that invested in non-American supply chains will not reverse those investments overnight. The infrastructure built to bypass American markets will remain. This represents a structural change in the continental economic relationship. For decades, American policymakers assumed geographic proximity and economic integration made Canadian dependence permanent. The assumption proved correct for generations. But assumptions can be disrupted by policy choices that create sufficient incentive for change. The tariffs created exactly that incentive. The irony is profound. A policy designed to increase American leverage has instead accelerated the reduction of that leverage. A strategy meant to force concessions has instead unified Canadian political parties around transformation. Pressure intended to demonstrate American power has instead revealed its limits when applied to a sophisticated partner with global options. The numbers tell the complete story. 12 trade agreements signed, 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles entering the Canadian market, 240% growth in petroleum exports to China, 8.3% increase in non-American export growth. $1,300 annual cost per American household. 70% probability the Supreme Court overturns IEEPA tariffs. These are not predictions. These are the documented results of current policy. And ordinary people on both sides of the border are paying the price right now.